Tonight's hobby enhancement is the last of the Lagavulin. Tonight we're having our first crack at a Armies on Parade video. What we've got here before us is Emilio's Tomb King's army. And oh my, isn't it big. Emilio, what's the story with this lot?
I guess with Warhammer Fantasy, I've always wanted a Tomb King's army, and the closest I got to it 30 years ago was I started collecting vampire counts. And I had a couple of pieces here and there of Tomb Kings, and never enough to form a block of 20 or 30 or special characters. So I always sort of traded them off to help complete my other armies. And Vampire Counts was the winner in building an army at that time. But Tomb Kings, I never sort of really, it never took off the ground back then. And it was one of those sort of armies, I always liked it, but either found it hard to find, to buy, or not many people had an army like this, so I never got to see it often except in magazines, or if there was someone that had a war game and talked about seeing someone who had a Tomb King's army. So over 30 years it always was in the back of my mind, if I could afford it, I'll get it. But unfortunately it wasn't made more recently, with Age of Sigma coming through, and the people that had them held on to them, so they were really, really hard to find secondhand, and very hard to find new in the box, because people just held on to what they had, or they were finding it hard to build their own armies. So an opportunity came up. A South Australian guy said, I've got 10,000 points of Tomb Kings, and I'm happy with that, but I've got some left over that I want to sell to a wargaming group, anyone in the group interested to buy them. And they were just thrown in a big, large shoebox, a randomised number of figures in a shoebox, and you could only really see what was on the top of the shoebox. And I thought, wow, this is not only just a great number of figures that I can see at the top of the shoebox, but I think this goes 3-4 figures deep. And he said, I'll take $200 for it. I was very quick, probably the second person to jump and say, I'd be interested to buy it, but the first one to show cash for the $200. So this year was my first jump at buying a mixed bag of Tomb Kings figures, and I'm so glad that I did, because he was very, very generous with what he put in that shoebox. And that was it. I was hooked, and I said, I've now got 1,500 points worth of Tomb Kings for $200 second hand, and they were good figures. Half of them were metal, and the other half were fine cast. And then I added a few things from my Vampire Counts. So the chariots, as you'll notice, are not Tomb King's chariots, but because I war game in man caves with a group of mates, they're okay with me using Vampire Count chariots. But Tomb King chariots, hard to come by as well, expensive. But I had these, they were spare from my Vampire Counts army, so I've added those to this army group. And then more recently, there was a guy that reached out to me from Canberra, and he said, look, I've got a whole lot of Tomb Kings, would you be interested in buying it? And we came up, agreed on a price, and by the time, it was my birthday, and then I had a bit of extra spare cash, and next thing I know, I dropped another $500 on the table. But for that $500, it basically provided me with another 2,500 points towards the army. So a substantial purchase. When you look at what I actually got for that $500, I think I did very, very well. I think he was considerate, because he's saying, look, I'm selling my Tomb Kings to someone who wants to wargame. And I think for the people that are out there, they're always more considerate to sell to another wargamer who will get the same joy that they've had with these figures in wargaming, rather than just selling to a collector. So what you see in front of you is roughly about 4,000 points of Tomb Kings, but there's a really good balance between characters, heroes, lords. You've got your main core, your special, your rare units, and there's enough variety, there's enough flexibility that I can play this army 3-4 different ways if I field it as a 2,000 or 2,500 point army. So I'm really pleased that the outlay this year has been about $700. But for that $700, if I had to pay eBay prices, I'd probably easily be paying more like $2,000 for the collection that's here that I use for wargaming. You'll notice in the centre 2 of the larger pieces. Now we all know that they're not genuine pieces. I think I bought them, they're like Dungeons and Dragons figures. But those figures, if I had to buy them, because you can't buy them off the shelf, they're hard to find and they cost between $150 and $300 each. Well, I paid $30 each for those, and I modified them so they actually could be used in my army. And
so what's the name of the thing that these are standing in for?
Yeah, so the swap over for those are the, I apologise about the pronunciations, but the Kemrian War Sphinx.
Yes.
Is one of them, and
I see what you mean. Yeah, it's got a human head.
And a Necrolithe is the other.
Right.
So
And,
the distinct difference is one's got the chariot with the Tomb King's crew, whereas the other one doesn't. But it has not wings, but it's got these blades, 4 blades. Well, I found these guys with wings, but they're very close to having a Tomb King's feel to them at $30 each. So again, in the man's cave for wargaming, my friends are okay for me to substitute as long as we say what they are at the beginning of the game.
So something about the Games Workshop economy. I mean, you'd spend $150 minimum to get the equivalent in what is it, Age of Sigmar, God help me.
Yeah, Age of Sigmar.
We get $30 for something roughly the same size, really nice casting quality, already primed. It's the Dungeons and Dragons equivalent of fine cast, but they seem to have figured out how to make the stuff actually work. And it will look fantastic once the conversion's done and it's all painted up and based.
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be a replacement for the real thing, but because Tomb Kings is so hard to get and so expensive to buy second hand, I just want to have the ability to play those figures, and they're about the right scale, and the way that I've styled them, they are recognisable to be used as alternatives.
Now I've noticed the thing, like mostly I've bought new armies over the years, with the exception of the one I'm doing at the moment, and one which I'm thinking of buying if I can convince myself to drop that much cash. But you routinely buy your stuff second hand.
Yeah, I found that the dollar goes a lot further, and sometimes there are real diamonds in the find, because some of the figures you just can't buy new. If you can't buy them new, and people aren't willing to part with the ones that they've put away 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I understand why they don't want to part with them, or collectors who think that they leave them in the box as they are, because that's the maximum value for those collectibles. For the guys like myself who just want to wargame, unless we make them out of green putty and do the best we can, you're not going to find an easy substitute for some of the wargaming figures that appear for Tomb Kings. There are alternative branded figures, but I try to find Games Workshop figures secondhand. And there's a variety of makers that Games Workshop have embraced over the years. And so you'll find there's a mixture here of metal figures, plastic figures, and what are some of the others, I guess?
Crap cast, I believe, is the other one, if it's not plastic or metal.
Yeah.
Talk us through what's actually metal out of this lot.
Yeah, so probably some of the larger items, if we're looking, would be towards the back, if you have a look at those giant scorpions that are there, one of them's metal and one of them's fine cast. Now, on the video, it's going to be hard to tell which one is metal and which one's fine cast. The only way you're going to know is just by picking up and feeling the weight of the piece. So the detail in both of those, I'd say, is very similar. But the one that's on the white one here is the metal one, and the darker one is the fine cast, and the only difference is the shape of the base. But we do use square bases for wargaming 8th edition, so at some point I'm going to need to put a template base to represent that base is square, which I'll probably put underneath that base just for purposes of wargaming. If we're looking at some of the other pieces that are there, if we're looking at the biggest pieces, this is Cetra, the imperishable. That's 475 points in 8th edition, and you've got basically your Tomb King, and he's the general of this army. 475 points is a lot of points to spend on a figure for a war game, but he's hard to find new. So second hand, this one's been customised. So for those people that do recognise the difference in figures, you've got your undead horses, you've got your Tomb King, but the chariot actually belongs to Chaos. It's a Chaos chariot. But it's been customised, and I think quite well. And I didn't want to replace the chariot with the Tomb King's chariot. I was quite satisfied to keep it that way.
Purists may have an opinion on this, but I think there is something to be said about having some uniqueness in your army, where it's a piece that isn't just a cookie cutter of everybody else's, 500 point special character.
Yeah. So another large metal piece is the Screaming Skull catapult and the crew. So yes, all metal. You obviously can get them in fine cast as well. I was fortunate to find that one in metal. Very pleased with it. I think from a wargaming perspective, it's always good to have a war machine that has a long range on a large table. Yeah. And it definitely...
well, I certainly experienced that with your 3 fucking hell cannon. But showing my age here, I know a lot of people like the new plastics. The new plastic quality is really good. But the later era metal was really well made, really well cast, great sculpts.
Yeah.
It was sophisticated stuff before it all got, might disappeared in the face of the crap cast initially, and then it's all gone to the new on sprue stuff.
This is more, I think it's the 6th and 8th edition style, but there are earlier editions of Tomb Kings and also Vampire Counts, which was a smaller scale of catapult. Right. But I like this particular size. It's quite intimidating to get a larger piece on the table, because the enemy, in this case your competitor, is going to say, "Oh, I've got to take that out." It's a large, imposing piece. It's got to go. So size is important.
One of the things that size is important.
Size is important.
One of the things that sets Warhammer apart from a lot of other 28mm games, and especially the 15mm stuff, is that everything's got height. If you're playing Napoleonics, you have this carpet of infantry. Sure, they're 28mm, but they're all fairly short. There's nobody taller than a bloke and a horse. You don't get stuff like this.
Yeah,
rearing up over the battlefield in
towering,
an intimidating manner.
And in fact, if you have a look at the just the body of it, and being that it's a snake, they could actually make it a lot taller. You could rise up further, and so there's quite a bit of length in its body.
Don't give him ideas. We've already got the dark elf dragon who looks like he's going to tip over himself.
And the other large metal piece is the Necrolithe Colossus, which is, for a lot of people would know from Vampire Counts and others, it's a bone giant. And that's 170 points just there. But the great thing about the bone giant, and you can't see it from that figure, is you've got the option to use the arrows of Asaph, which provide no penalty for shooting. And you can actually give him the bow of the desert. It costs 20 more points. But what you've got is you turn him into a mobile bolt thrower.
Yes, and don't my wood elves know that?
Range 48 inches, strength 6, multiple wound. And that becomes an ultimate giant killing machine from a distance. So you combine that with the catapult, you've got 2 massive long-distance killing machines in this army.
Yes, I've been on the receiving end of that bolt throw. It did rather annoy me after a bit.
Not all armies have the dynamic of long-range shooting, medium-range shooting, and short-range shooting, cavalry, chariots, fast-moving, monstrous beasts.
Yeah, these have a movement of 7 in 8th edition.
They're very, very fast, and they're hard-hitting, and they've got strong staying power. And I'll talk some more about them later. But then you've got slow-moving units as well. But if you keep them close to your Tomb Kings and you buff them, they're fantastic.
That this army actually does have a lot of diversity, and it's not like a dwarf army where the only way you get any movement is if you jump in an increasingly weird-looking gyrocopter.
Or even like Wood Elves can be much more limiting. You know, you really need to be an experienced wargamer to win a battle with Wood Elves. Now, I know they can win games, but I've played Wood Elves often, and I found that they win 1 in every 4 games. So, and that's only if everything works your way. The terrain works your way, the scenario works your way, the dice work your way, and the Wood Elves might get...
Yeah, that's an interesting point. The Wood Elves have a hell of a lot going for them, especially if you're one of those people who insists on taking Treekin, which I just hate on principle. I mean, if ever there was a unit that was designed to meet a technical niche without any decent reason to otherwise exist, that'd be it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the lack of tanks, chariots, cannon, even bolt throwers in the Wood Elves.
And even buffing. The Tomb King's army, there are so many combinations you can do in Fantasy Warhammer that will buff these units. And that's so some of them will actually have characters that provide an area effect. And if you keep your units close to that area of effect, normally about 12 inches is the area of effect, you actually get +2 this, +1 that, extra attack this, extra move that. The combination of those buffs make this a much more significant army to play with because of the extra options that you have from that buffing. And some armies don't provide those options for buffing. And so this army can move slow, it can move fast, it can shoot, it can charge. It's a massive arrangement of combinations. The spells aren't ridiculously dangerous, but they're complementary to buffing this army further. So,
Right. So it's all about using magic in order to make the damn thing work properly.
or even just raising the dead, for example. You get some of the more elite units and raise them. And so you've got a really strong block. And that block keeps coming back to reinforce numbers.
I remember that certainly had me convinced that those extra points I'd spent on poison arrows in my Wood Elves were well invested.
And this one's a fine cast, but that's my Casket of Souls, 135 points. What a really interesting model. And it's quite, for 135 points, it's really, really dynamic. And again, intimidating for your opponent who want to take it out, just like they want to take out the catapult. So
well, the good news is this fucker sits still, so it actually can.
It does things like unleash souls. It actually adds to your power dice. You've got guards on it. It's got a range that's quite reasonable in its magic range. And so it's also a ballistic weapon with its magic.
And it also is ultimately powered by God, so even if you do let it fall into the hands of the Nazis, it will kill the bastards for you.
Well, even if you kill it, it's still going to explode. For
an
area effect. So if the enemy's attacking it and it explodes, it might get the last hurrah against the enemy. It's quite significant strength hits on that one too. So
I just want to pick up on something because you were talking before about the dollar value of buying things second hand, and I know from having seen your crazy selection of stuff that you'll trade in your existing army bits for better ones when they come up on the market. Yeah. Do you ever paint your own stuff?
I have, but it's probably if I had a choice between finding the right figures for my army, that's my joy, is to find the pieces that I need to build a competitive army. The second thing is I'm quite happy to build it. I'm quite happy to get the block numbers that are necessary to make these units effective. For example, skeleton archers. I've got about 40 skeleton archers. Now, this can really turn this army into a shooter army. And the advantage with Tomb Kings is because of the arrows of Asaph, there's no penalty to shoot. So just imagine skeletons moving, shooting, range 24 inches, strength 3, volley fire, no penalties when shooting. You add that up with your catapult, you add that up with your giant, you add that up with the Ushabati. These fellas here actually have great weapons. But you can swap the great weapons out, and you can swap them out for great bows. So,
this is actually pretty full on mention. That's a metal guy, isn't he?
yeah, so these guys are metal. And you'll see that they've actually got crocodile heads, or...
Yeah, I didn't realise that before. This blows do look fantastic.
So, and well painted as well. So I appreciate, back to your point about do I paint my figures? If someone paints them well, I respect them for it. And I'll pay, obviously, more for a second-hand figure if it's painted well. Most people will. Some people say, strip it down and I'm going to paint it my way. But I use it to wargame. So, unfortunately, they're going to fall over. They're going to knock into each other. There will be some slight chipping. I don't just put them on the shelf to look at. I actually want to use them.
It's interesting, people do things for different reasons. Like, before you talked me into buying a second-hand Dark Elf army, which I'm currently very, very slowly rehabilitating, I bought everything new on sprue and painted it all up from scratch, and that was just the way which I assumed the hobby was done. The whole idea of buying an army second hand and trading out the figures that are not painted for figures that are painted by somebody else is a different way of going about it. But you know, we all have different different amounts of spare time in our lives, different amounts of money, different skill sets and different interests. And I think there's something to be said for engaging in the hobby, the way that works for you.
Yeah, I find as a minimum for painting, my friends let me undercoat my figures, and as long as they're holding the right kinds of weapons to represent my army list, then that's acceptable with my friends. So if you've got wargaming figures and you want to wargame, I've seen armies that are unpainted, not undercoated. But our minimum is at least undercoat them, get them with the right sort of weapons to represent what you have, or make it clear what the upgrades are to those weapons. In this particular case, for my $700, I'd have to say about 60% of this army is painted to a good standard, and then the rest is, the balance would be undercoated. And I might get a friend who would be kind enough to paint them to a wargaming standard, which is not a high standard, but for this game that we play, it's definitely going to be acceptable.
And I'm just thinking back to when we used to do tournaments up until when 8th edition blew up. I'd never been to a tournament where every army was painted, and there were people who turn up with an army which is grey plastic, some which wasn't even glued on, and maybe they'd run out of blue tack and there'd be a jumble of pieces on a base, and that would represent, I don't know, a Chaos Lord or some such scenario.
And sometimes they didn't glue them because they hadn't painted them, and it's easy to paint figures in pieces than already glued up. For example, the last thing you would glue up is a shield on a figure, because you want to get the detail of the paint behind the shield. And a lot of cases, if you just glue things up, you lose detail.
Yeah, so you get this impressionistic, this army's going to be so great when I paint it, so great when I paint it. You run into the same guy 6 to 12 months later, and he's got a new army which is in much the same condition as the last army, and that last one's in a box somewhere. One can only hope they're selling the bits on to somebody who'll actually do something with them.
Well, again, there are people out there that collect, serious collectors, and I respect where they're coming from, but I only buy what I need for my wargaming. And so every piece that you see on this table will be used in a battle based on a scenario that we have running into the future. So a shooter-up army, this could be a shooter-up army, isn't always going to be the best army under some scenarios. So
there's a guy who got a little bit notorious a few years ago because he took into a tournament one of these armies with a 90-strong bowman army. And he worked out the math that if you're 90 strong, you're going to get 30 hits a turn, and 15 wounds, and so on, and maybe he buffs it. And if a unit charges him to try and take him out, he's worked out the math on how likely he is to kill it on the way in. And he basically just pick a unit a turn and smash the thing.
Yeah.
And that turned out to be an exceptionally effective army. I think he won a tournament with it.
Well, I like shooter up armies, but I also found this is a magic army. So there are spells that actually will help buff shooting as well. But just back to this, these Yushabati, they're 50 points each, so they're not cheap, but they are strength 4, toughness 4, wounds 3. They attack 3 attacks.
Yep, so monstrous infantry doing what monstrous infantry do.
And they move 5, so they're quick enough.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing about them as well is I can swap out their great weapon with a great bow. So they've got a range of 30 inches, strength 6 hits.
I do love this. I've got the all-powerful killing machine miniature to go and shoot.
And great in hand-to-hand combat.
Some fucker's going to go and ruin their day.
So...
who painted which miniatures here?
So the fellow that sold me these was from Canberra. Now, the standard of the painting was very high. So the only downside with buying secondhand is you're not going to get consistency in your painting. And you may not be able to match this army up perfectly without doing some stripping.
Yeah.
But because I use it for wargaming, I'll try and get the colours and the theme as close as I can. But for me, I'm not a perfectionist on the painting side. I just want to get them used, get the models on the table and have a game.
Yeah, we don't have a score for army painting when we do one of our garage games. You may have noticed from the other videos we've got on the YouTube channel here. Right, so you were saying earlier that you reckon this is probably about 4,000 points.
Yeah, it's, I think, and there's enough flexibility there that we normally, when we war game amongst our group of mates here in Adelaide, 2,000 to 2,500 points is a good 4-hour war game. And after work, after dinner, we can still get the war game in. We go home at midnight, but we still get a good war game out of 2,000, 2,500 points. There is enough here that I can actually build this army 3-4 times over to play a different army tactically each game. So it's not going to be the same experience every time. And that's the beautiful thing about Tomb Kings is you can actually make this army to work differently on the battlefield based on the combinations and buffs that you put to this army.
Yes, it's going to have some variety. Well, it's a very nice army. It's a little bit scary. I'm thinking about what I have in the way of 4,000 points that I could pitch against it, and I'm not sure if the Wood Elves, I'd really trust them to stand up against this. I think they'd probably struggle a bit.
Yeah.
Dwarves might have a crack. It's definitely a target-rich environment for the cannon.
My favourite are the Tomb Guard, which is, if Chris pans back, the Tomb Guard, they're all metal, but the Tomb Guard are 11 points each. Yeah, they're 11 points each. Now, for 11 points each, by the time you buff them up, one of the dynamic things is the Necrolithe actually will provide them with the benefit of hatred, which is actually going to help them so that they get the chance to re-roll misses.
If you think about it, that's very existential. These dudes are dead, and they still hate people. They still
hate people. And so the Necrolithe will buff them with hatred. On top of that, the Tomb Herald, which will be in that unit as well, will help them recover D6 plus 2 wounds each turn. So you're killing them and they're coming back and they've got hatred. And on top of that, if you've actually got them with your Tomb King, their weapon skill reverts to the weapon skill of the Tomb King. Now the Tomb King's weapon skill is weapon skill 6. The Tomb Guard are normally weapon skill 3. So if you've got them within 12 inches of their king, their weapon skill goes up to 6.
That is something which we noticed in a previous game. This army needs to work in synchrony in order to work at all. Otherwise, it loses some of its strength, can be picked off piecemeal. I did have some fun in the first game against these guys because I managed to disrupt that synchrony, and that was almighty fun on my part. In the second game, I had maybe didn't work quite so well.
Yeah, but you get a block of Tomb King guards, you buff them up, and they're ferocious. So the combination of recovering wounds, hatred, benefits of hatred, plus weapon skills 6, and they have tomb blades. Now those tomb blades give you killing blow.
Oh, of course they do.
So it's one hell of a tough unit. Now I've heard every army has one.
Maybe we should grind this down to like a 3,000 point army and hock my fucking demons at them.
Yeah.
We can all have killing blow together.
So I love that unit, absolutely love it, and it's definitely very. This army is a highly competitive army. If you want to win, you can't guarantee to win with this army, but with the right placement, with the right strategy, with the right combination of contacts in battle, they will win.
I really now want to defeat these guys in a stand-up fight. We'll have to tee up an afternoon because that's going to take a long time to get through 4,000 points worth of game. We never have a game where we're not interrupted. But look, thank you very much for bringing these guys out, laying them all out, talk us through what you've got. It's a downright intimidating looking army, and I do look forward to hocking dice at it.
Yeah, and if you've got your man shed and you've actually got a table that you can expand out, I know a lot of people will start with smaller wargaming tables, but if you've got the option to expand your table out, look, a small table, 2,000 points, fine. But when you've got weapons that have a 48-inch range or a 30-inch range, you really want to use them on a larger table. And this is where Tomb King stands apart. If you can go to a larger table, they actually will have an advantage because of their ability to shoot at range and heavy hitting at range. A smaller table, you're going to miss that opportunity after about round 1, round 2, and you're right into the hand-to-hand melee. So the larger the table, the more dynamic this army becomes.
I'm sure the Empire will have an opinion about that, but on the other hand, the Empire's going to not enjoy very much getting stomped on by all this manner of madness. On that note, I think feel free to hit like, subscribe, etc. We're thinking we might trot out a few other armies just to show them off because we've got rather a lot of armies between us. So we'll do that another day. Until then, time to call it a night.